May 1945. A cold morning mist hangs over the wire fence of a recently liberated internment camp on the outskirts of Lübeck, its wooden watchtowers still silhouetted against the pale northern sky. The war in Europe is collapsing, yet silence lingers in places where fear once ruled. The gates stand open now, guarded not by sentries but by exhausted Allied soldiers who move carefully, as if afraid to disturb the quiet too suddenly. From the low barracks emerge children, thin, cautious, their steps unsure on the muddy ground. They cluster together, blinking into the light, studying the unfamiliar trucks rolling into the courtyard. Relief workers climb down from the vehicles, prying open crates stenciled with foreign markings. Inside are rations, blankets, medicine, and something the soldiers were told to distribute only after food had been handed out. The first wooden toy car appears in a worker's hand, its small wheels catching the weak sunlight. The children do not move. Some stare as if it were an artifact from another world. Others glance toward the adults, uncertain whether they are allowed to approach. It is in this suspended moment, between hunger and hope, that the story of how POW children saw toys for the first time begins. And it leads us back to the world that created such silence. To understand why a simple toy could stop a liberated child in their tracks, we must return to the years when war dismantled the most basic elements of childhood. The Second World War did not merely redraw borders or armies, it reshaped the daily rhythms of civilian life, stripping families of routines, possessions, and the small comforts that once signaled safety. For the countless civilians caught in its path, especially in territories occupied by Germany and Japan, the concept of normality dissolved piece by piece. From 1942 onward, as the conflict intensified, thousands of foreign nationals, colonial families, and resistance suspects were rounded up and confined in civilian internment camps. In Europe, these were scattered across German-controlled regions, among them the camps at Amersfoort, Liebenau, and Laufen. In the Pacific, Japan operated large civilian compounds such as Santo Tomas in Manila, Changi in Singapore, and the Los Baños camp southeast of Manila. Within these barbed enclosures were not only adults, but entire families, including children who entered the gates carrying only what their parents could bring in their hands. Inside these camps, possessions quickly lost their original meaning. Clothing was patched repeatedly until it became nearly indistinguishable from rags. Utensils were improvised from scrap. A single bar of soap could become a bargaining tool, a luxury that families debated when to use. Toys, the things that occupied the margins of a peaceful life, vanished early. Wooden blocks were burned for heat during harsh winters in Europe. Metal toys were seized or repurposed as war materials. Parents hid a few keepsakes at first, but hunger, cold, and disease narrowed priorities. A doll that once comforted a child suddenly felt like an impractical use of space or energy. Children born inside the camps never saw these objects at all. Their earliest memories were framed by fences, watchtowers, ration lines, and the constant vigilance of adults who feared punishment for minor infractions. Their worlds were bounded by rules they did not understand, by shortages they could not articulate, and by a silence their parents tried desperately to explain away. When adults spoke in hushed tones, children learned not to ask questions. When adults cried quietly at night, children learned to pretend they did not hear. Food scarcity defined daily life. Interned families survived on thin soups, black bread, or rice measured to the gram. In the Pacific, rations dropped so drastically by 1944 that many families risked malnutrition or death. In Europe, the winter of 1944-45 brought temperatures that froze water in cups beside bunks. Under these conditions, play became rare, not forbidden by the guards, but eroded by exhaustion. A game requires energy, imagination, and a feeling of safety, all of which were in short supply. Yet children remain resilient even in the harshest environments. They invented games using stones, sticks, or fabric scraps. They drew lines in the dirt and pretended to race. They created makeshift dolls from bundled cloth. But these creations, while meaningful, were not toys in the formal sense. They lacked the color, polish, and sense of ownership that real toys brought in the pre-war years. More importantly, these improvised objects were born of necessity, not abundance. They were reminders of everything the children did not have. Meanwhile, the outside world moved deeper into total war. Nations diverted industrial capacity toward weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. Factories that once produced bicycles, typewriters, and children's toys shifted to manufacturing artillery components or aircraft frames. Global shipping routes were disrupted. Civilian goods were rationed, even in countries not occupied. A child in London or New York might still possess a toy, but even their shelves grew emptier as the war economy consumed material and labor. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced across Western Europe and the Pacific Islands, information about the conditions inside internment and POW family camps reached commanders and relief organizations. Reports described malnourished civilians, untreated diseases, and children who were physically alive, yet psychologically subdued. Food, medicine, and clothing became obvious necessities. But relief planners, particularly those from the Red Cross and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, began to discuss something else as well: the intangible needs of children who had lived for years without joy. The idea of sending toys was not sentimental, it was strategic. Psychologists advising relief agencies argued that restoring play was essential for mental recovery. Soldiers who liberated earlier camps in Italy had noted that children responded dramatically when handed small items to hold: pencils, spoons, even buttons. These reactions hinted at how deprived their senses had been. Thus, as the war neared its final months, relief teams prepared not only food crates, but small bundles of donated toys: simple wooden cars, cloth dolls, metal spinning tops, hand-painted figurines, items durable enough to survive travel and humble enough to be produced even during wartime shortages. Their destination, camps that, for years, had existed in silence. And inside those camps were children who had never known the sound of a toy's spinning wheel or the weight of a small doll resting in their hands. This is the world into which those toys would eventually arrive, shaping a moment that would be remembered long after liberation. As 1945 approached, the strategic landscape of the war shifted with startling speed. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. In the West, Allied forces pushed through the Ardennes after the Battle of the Bulge and crossed the Rhine. In the Pacific, island after island fell as American forces closed in on the Philippines and prepared for the eventual invasion of Japan. With every mile gained, Allied commanders uncovered more civilian internment sites, each carrying its own history of deprivation, its own ledger of suffering. The closer armies moved to these camps, the more urgent relief planning became. Intelligence units compiled reports from escaped prisoners, captured documents, and intercepted communications. These findings were forwarded to humanitarian organizations that had spent years negotiating access with occupying powers. The International Red Cross, though often restricted by Axis authorities, had attempted to deliver parcels throughout the war, but many camps, especially civilian ones, received little beyond occasional medical supplies. When liberation finally became possible, aid groups knew they had to arrive quickly to prevent a secondary wave of deaths caused by disease and starvation. Relief supply lists were drafted with military precision. Food came first: condensed milk, dehydrated vegetables, vitamin tablets, tins of meat. Clothing and footwear followed. Medical stores included bandages, sulfonamide packets, quinine, and disinfectants. But scattered among the crates were smaller packages labeled simply children's stores. They contained items donated quietly throughout the war by families who hoped someday their gifts would reach a child who needed them more. Schools, churches, and community groups in Canada, Australia, Britain, and the United States collected simple, durable toys, objects modest in design but powerful in intent. Still, not all commanders saw toys as essential cargo. Some argued that trucks and aircraft should carry only survival necessities, but reports from early liberations began to change minds. When the Allies freed the Vittel camp in France, witnesses described how children stared blankly at soldiers offering food, as though unable to process kindness. In Italy, children rescued from camps near Bolzano hesitated to approach anything unfamiliar, even when it was meant to help them. Psychological officers warned that liberation would not be an instant return to normality. Many children would be confused, frightened, or emotionally withdrawn. A toy, they argued, could become a bridge between fear and trust. In the Pacific, similar assessments emerged. The liberation of the Philippines was expected to reveal civilian camps in dire condition. Troops preparing for the operation studied accounts from survivors of earlier escapes, noting that children lacked stimulation and had little concept of ordinary childhood objects. When the 11th Airborne Division prepared to raid Los Baños, planners added a request for comfort items to accompany the first wave of humanitarian teams. These were not luxuries. They were tools to help children recognize that the war surrounding them was finally ending. As relief agencies coordinated shipments, a careful question remained. What would these children feel when handed something they had never known? For children born before the war, toys were memories buried beneath years of privation. For those born inside the camps, or too young to remember life outside, the objects would be entirely new. A doll's painted face might resemble a stranger. A spinning top might seem like a device whose purpose needed decoding. Even the colors, faded though they often were, could surprise children accustomed to the monotone world of camp uniforms and weathered timber. Many relief workers later recalled the same detail. Children were often hesitant to touch the toys at first. They looked to adults for permission. They examined the objects as if they might break under the slightest pressure. Some children held toys with the same caution they use for ration bowls, unsure whether possession meant safety or punishment. These moments stayed with the workers for decades, shaping their understanding of how deeply war had narrowed the boundaries of childhood. As Allied forces approached the gates of the camps across Europe and the Pacific, the preparations intensified. The war was entering its final, violent months. Yet within the noise of artillery, bombing raids, and last defensive stands, relief teams quietly carried something different, symbols of a world beyond wire and hunger. They did not know exactly when liberation would come, but they were ready for the moment when children would finally step into the open and encounter something they had been long denied, the ability to play. And when that moment came, it would unfold with a simplicity that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the war around it. A truck entering a courtyard, a crate being opened, a small toy placed gently into a child's hand. This is the point at which multiple perspectives begin to converge, revealing how one event can hold layers of meaning far beyond its surface. For the children inside POW and civilian internment camps, time did not move in the same way it did for those beyond the fences. Days blended into one another with a monotony that made childhood feel less like a phase of life, and more like a distant rumor. Playgrounds were replaced by ration queues. Classrooms, when they existed, were improvised spaces staffed by exhausted adults who struggled to maintain routines while malnutrition and fear pressed on every lesson. A child's world, normally one of imagination and exploration, narrowed to the few meters they were allowed to roam. Many of the youngest prisoners formed their earliest memories inside the camp environment. They knew the sound of boots before they understood their own names. They learned to read the faces of adults not for reassurance, but for signs of danger. When guards walked by, children instinctively fell silent. When food arrived, they lined up without being told. Even laughter, when it appeared, came cautiously, as though joy was a limited resource not to be wasted. The absence of toys was not simply the absence of objects, it was the absence of a language that children use to understand the world. Toys teach cause and effect, creativity, problem-solving. They encourage social interaction. They create emotional comfort. Without them, children improvised, but improvisation carried its own weight. A bundle of rags shaped into a doll did not feel like ownership. A stick dragged through the dirt did not feel like freedom. These makeshift playthings were born out of scarcity, not hope. By the time liberation neared, many children had grown into a form of guarded quietness. They learned not to expect gifts, not to anticipate surprises, and not to reach for anything that might be refused. It was into this emotional landscape that relief workers would eventually place the first real toys many of these children had ever seen, and their reactions cannot be understood without recognizing how deeply war had pressed pause on their childhoods. From a military standpoint, the liberation of POW and internment camps was not merely a humanitarian act. It was a logistical operation requiring precision, prioritization, and foresight. Commanders had to ensure that once the gates were opened, a second crisis did not begin. Civilians emerging from years of deprivation needed nutrition, hydration, medical stabilization, and shelter. Every hour counted. Trucks, aircraft, and supply chains were calibrated to deliver essentials as efficiently as possible. Food shipments had to be carefully balanced. Doctors warned that giving starving civilians too much too quickly could be fatal, so rations were measured and cautious. Medical supplies were triaged based on expected cases. Dehydration, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, vitamin deficiencies. Clothing and blankets were essential in the cold European spring and in the monsoon-prone Pacific. Yet within these operations, relief planners made a striking decision: to allocate space, however limited, for non-essential but psychologically vital items, especially for children. Toys were light, compact, and durable, making them feasible additions to cargo when weight restrictions were tight. They were not placed above medicine or food, but they were included alongside them, recognized as a different kind of necessity. Logistics officers observed something important. The distribution of toys during earlier liberations had an unexpected practical effect. Children who received toys tended to stay near relief stations, allowing medics to reach them more easily. Families remained calmer when they saw gestures extending beyond survival. The presence of toys signaled that liberation was not temporary, that normal life was beginning to reassemble itself, piece by piece. In difficult terrain, especially in the Philippines, engineers, paratroopers, and support teams moved with crates strapped to their vehicles or parachute bundles. These crates contained not only nourishment, but symbols of safety. When the moment came to deliver them, soldiers often understood instinctively that these small objects served a far larger purpose, restoring the emotional balance of communities fractured by years of captivity. Thus, the presence of toys in liberation operations was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate, tactical choice rooted in the understanding that rebuilding lives required more than filling stomachs. It required restoring dignity, identity, and the fragile architecture of childhood. To an adult, a toy might appear simple: a carved figure, a cloth doll, a painted wooden car. But in the context of liberation, toys carried a symbolic power far beyond their physical form. For children raised in environments shaped by scarcity, a toy represented something they had never possessed, an object that existed solely for them, without obligation, without rules, without a survival function. During the war, nearly every item a child handled in a camp served a purpose. Bowls, blankets, shirts, scrap wood, all were utilitarian. Nothing belonged purely to imagination. This created a mindset in which objects were valued only for their practicality. A toy shattered that framework instantly. A spinning top served no nutritional function, offered no warmth, and could not be traded for food. Its only purpose was to delight. For a child accustomed to a world defined entirely by necessity, this was a profound shift in perspective. Many children initially treated toys like contraband, examining them cautiously, unsure if they were allowed to keep such a thing. Others held them tightly as though expecting them to be taken away. Some were visibly afraid. Relief workers later wrote about children who seemed overwhelmed, even confused, by the idea that something beautiful could belong to them without condition. But once a child accepted a toy, its symbolic impact became clear. It represented safety. It represented choice. It represented a future in which imagination mattered again. And for adults watching, the sight of a child turning a small wooden wheel or cradling a doll was not merely touching. It was evidence that the psychological walls built by years of captivity had begun to crack. The toy was never just a toy. It was the first tangible sign that childhood could return. These perspectives set the stage for deeper layers of the story: how parents, soldiers, and even the systems that created the camps viewed the rediscovery of play. For parents inside the camps, the hardest part was not their own hunger or exhaustion. It was witnessing what captivity did to their children. Mothers and fathers tried desperately to shield their sons and daughters from the psychological weight of imprisonment, but no amount of whispered reassurance or improvised games could conceal the larger truth. The war had stolen what should have been their children's most formative years. Parents watched their children adapt in ways that broke their hearts. They saw little ones learn to stand quietly in ration lines without complaint, to lower their voices instinctively when guards approached, to eat slowly because they never knew when the next meal might come. They watched them sleep lightly, roused by sounds no child should recognize. In these small behaviors, parents could see the erosion of innocence long before liberation. When the war finally ended and Allied troops opened the gates, many parents felt both hope and dread. Hope because freedom had returned, dread because they did not know what lay on the other side of that sudden change. Could a child who had lived so long in deprivation remember how to play? Would a toy feel familiar or foreign? The moment toys were distributed revealed answers that parents had not dared to imagine. Some children stared in confusion, unsure how to respond. Others touched the objects slowly, as though rediscovering a forgotten language. A few, after a long pause, allowed themselves to smile. Those smiles often broke the composure of the adults watching. Years of silent endurance collapsed into tears. It was not the toy itself that moved them. It was the realization that their children might recover, something they feared was permanently lost. For many parents, the sight of a doll held in small hands, or the sound of a toy car rolling across the ground, was the first moment they believed their family could truly begin again. Childhood had been interrupted, but perhaps it was not gone forever. The soldiers who liberated the camps arrived hardened by months or years of fighting. They had seen destruction in cities, brutality on battlefields, and the heavy toll war exacted on civilians. But nothing quite prepared them for the faces of the children behind the fences. Many soldiers later wrote that the expressions they saw were unlike anything encountered in combat. Not fear, not relief, but a kind of stunned emptiness. Distributing food and medical aid was a priority, yet soldiers understood instinctively that children needed more than calories. Many troops carried small items in their pockets: gum, chocolate, pencils, a carved piece of wood, objects they had kept through the war, as lucky charms or mementos. When they saw the children, those items were often the first things they offered. Official toy crates arrived shortly after, but the earliest gestures were deeply personal. Soldiers knelt to place an object into a child's hand, speaking in soft voices even when they shared no common language. They were careful not to move too quickly, aware of how easily a child's trust could shatter. When the children finally reached out, hesitant but hopeful, it created a moment that many soldiers remembered for the rest of their lives. These acts were not part of their military orders. They were born from the soldiers' own need to restore something within themselves. After months of delivering destruction, giving toys allowed them to deliver humanity instead. It reminded them that the war had an end, and that the end meant rebuilding rather than breaking. Veterans later spoke of these encounters in memoirs, describing them as some of the most emotional moments of their service. Amid the ruins and smoke, amid fatigue and loss, they were witnesses to something gentle. Children rediscovering joy, and soldiers rediscovering the reason they fought. To understand why toys were so shocking to liberated children, one must also examine the systems that removed them in the first place. The internment of civilians during the Second World War was not a spontaneous phenomenon. It was the result of organized policies enacted by governments seeking control, security, or strategic advantage. In German-occupied Europe, civilian internees were held because of nationality, political suspicion, or alleged resistance activity. Personal belongings were restricted upon entry. Space was minimal, and anything deemed non-essential was confiscated or discouraged. Children's toys fell firmly into this category. They served no productive function, consumed valuable material, and were seen as unnecessary within the camp environment. In Japanese-held territories, resource shortages were far more severe. Civilian camps relied heavily on local supplies, many of which dwindled as Allied forces tightened their grip on the Pacific. Japanese authorities often prioritized their own military needs, leaving internees with drastically reduced rations. Toys were impossible luxuries. Even if a child entered a camp with one, it would likely break or be repurposed within weeks. Over time, administrators enforced stricter rules on possessions, partly to maintain order, and partly because scarcity made any non-essential object suspect. These systems were not designed with cruelty toward children as their explicit goal, but their consequences were nonetheless devastating. By reducing life to survival alone, the policies effectively erased childhood as a recognized stage of life. Children became small adults, expected to endure hardship, silence their emotions, and adapt to the harsh rhythms of camp existence. When liberation arrived, these structural forces did not disappear instantly. The effects lingered in the way children flinched at raised voices, hesitated before accepting gifts, or resisted playing freely. The toys delivered after liberation were not only symbols of hope, they were direct challenges to the systems that had denied children their rightful place in the world. This understanding leads naturally toward the decisive moments when liberation brought these worlds crashing together, when soldiers, relief workers, parents, and children all converged around a moment that would redefine their futures. The day the toys arrived did not begin with celebration. It began with uncertainty. The gates of the camp, so long a boundary between captivity and the world beyond, were open. Yet life did not instantly transform. Liberation unfolds slowly in places where fear has been a daily companion. It takes time for silence to lift, for habits born of caution to fade. But on that morning, change approached in the form of rumbling engines and the sound of boots on gravel. Allied soldiers moved through the courtyard with purposeful calm. Their faces, weary from weeks of combat, softened when they saw the children clustered near the barracks. Relief workers followed close behind, scanning the scene with practiced eyes. They were searching for signs: dehydration, fever, wounds hidden beneath clothing. The children watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, wondering whether these new arrivals would bring danger or deliverance. At the center stood a row of trucks packed with supplies. The first crates opened contained water and medical kits. Nurses knelt beside the smallest children, offering sips from canteens and checking for symptoms of shock. Others distributed food carefully measured to avoid overwhelming fragile stomachs. Each gesture was deliberate, shaped by weeks of preparation for this moment. But beneath the food and medicine lay another set of crates, lighter, smaller, marked differently. A soldier pried one open and paused. Inside were rows of wooden toys, cars painted in muted shades, small figures with jointed limbs, spinning tops crafted with wartime simplicity. Relief workers exchanged glances, as though confirming silently that the moment had arrived. The children noticed immediately, their eyes fixed on the objects, not with eagerness, but with a strange, quiet recognition that something unfamiliar was unfolding. A girl near the front tilted her head, studying the painted wheels as though trying to determine the purpose of the strange shapes. A boy stepped back, unsure whether approaching would break an unspoken rule. A nurse extended her hand toward a small child, thin, barefoot, no older than 4. In her palm rested a cloth doll with a stitched smile and yarn hair. The child did not reach for it. Instead, he looked up at her, searching her face for signals. Was this a test? Was this a trick? In the camp, nothing came without consequence. Possession carried risk. Wanting anything too openly could attract the wrong attention. The nurse waited. She lowered herself to the child's level, her voice gentle, her movements slow. Finally, the boy raised his hand and touched the doll's soft fabric. His fingers curled around it cautiously, as though holding something fragile and forbidden. When she let go fully, placing the doll entirely in his grasp, he blinked in surprise. For a moment, he simply stared at it, uncertain what to do next. Nearby, a soldier offered a wooden car to a pair of siblings who studied it silently. The older child nudged the car with one finger, watching it roll a short distance before stopping. She seemed startled by the motion. Then, slowly, she pushed it again, this time with more intention. Her younger brother imitated her, and the two repeated the action until the small wheels carved faint tracks in the dirt. Around the courtyard, similar scenes unfolded. Children approached the toys with the same caution they had learned for every object in the camp. Some examined them like artifacts from another world. Some held them tightly against their chests. A few did not know what to do at all and looked to their parents for guidance. The adults, weakened but watching intently, nodded through tears. Gradually, the atmosphere changed. The courtyard filled with subtle movement, small hands turning wheels, spinning tops, pressing dolls to their faces. Then sound returned, not loud, boisterous laughter, but soft, uncertain giggles, the kind that emerge when children test the boundaries of joy, unsure whether it is safe to let it grow. Relief workers felt the shift instantly. They had seen suffering in many forms, but this was different. This was the reappearance of something that had been missing for years. An instinct, a language unique to childhood. Soldiers who had marched through battlefields now found themselves standing still, watching quietly as life resumed in ways they had nearly forgotten were possible. One sergeant later wrote that, in that moment, the war seemed to stop moving. He described the sight not as victory, but as restoration, as though the world was stitching itself back together in the hands of children. The toys did not erase the hunger. They did not heal illness or mend trauma. But they represented a turning point, a spark that signaled the beginning of recovery, the first step toward a childhood, interrupted but not erased. And while this moment stood on its own, it was only one part of a broader wave of liberations where similar scenes played out again and again, each carrying its own quiet power. What happened in that courtyard was not an isolated moment. As spring turned to early summer in 1945, liberation radiated across 2 continents. Each newly freed camp revealed its own version of the same quiet miracle, children encountering toys, or anything meant purely for joy for the first time in years. In some places, the moments unfolded amid stunned silence. In others, they happened against a backdrop of chaos, smoke, and urgency. But everywhere, the transition was unmistakable, from survival to something resembling life. In the Philippines, the liberation of Los Baños on February 23, 1945, offered one of the most dramatic examples. Paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division entered the camp in a coordinated assault designed to save more than 2,000 internees from imminent execution. Amid the shouting, the rapid movements, and the rush to evacuate civilians onto amphibious trucks, soldiers found children too weak to stand without support. Families clung to one another, dazed by the sudden reversal of fortune. When medical teams arrived hours later with the first relief bundles, they distributed water, powdered milk, fruit, and quinine tablets. Only after the immediate danger passed did they begin handing out small items from field bags, pencils, paper, wrapped candies, combs. Some of the bundles included small toys donated by Filipino civilians who understood what the children had endured. Accounts describe children turning the objects over in their hands as though examining something from a forgotten dream. Even in the midst of evacuation, the toys anchored them, offering a focal point amid the disorienting rush of freedom. In Europe, similar scenes unfolded at a slower, quieter pace. When Allied forces reached the Laufen and Tittmoning camps near the Austrian border, they encountered children who had become miniature adults through necessity. Many stood protectively near their mothers, unsure whether liberation meant safety or simply a change in authority. When soldiers distributed the first wooden toys, often carved in England or Canada months earlier, the children approached them with deliberation. Some pressed the toys against their faces, absorbing the unfamiliar texture. Others placed them on the ground and studied their shape, as though learning the grammar of play from scratch. In a camp near Enschede in the Netherlands, a Dutch Red Cross worker recorded a striking moment in her field journal. She wrote of a girl, perhaps 6 or 7, whose hair was cropped short from repeated lice treatments. The worker offered her a small stuffed animal, an elephant sewn from leftover fabric. The girl accepted it with both hands, stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "Is it alive?" The question carried no confusion, it carried longing. The child had spent so long without anything soft to hold that the toy felt like a living presence. The worker noted that she did not correct the girl. She simply nodded and let the child keep her interpretation. Moments like this revealed how deeply captivity had shaped the emotional worlds of POW children. Toys did not merely entertain them, they reconnected them to ideas they had not felt in years: gentleness, affection, curiosity. In camp after camp, relief workers observed that once children accepted toys, they began to play not only alone but together. Play created community. It restored social bonds. It encouraged laughter that had been absent for so long that even the sound felt fragile. For soldiers, witnessing these transformations often produced emotions they struggled to articulate. Men who had crossed battlefields without fear found themselves overwhelmed by the sight of children clutching wooden figures or rolling a toy car across a dusty floor. They understood instinctively that they were not just delivering objects, they were delivering possibility. Some wrote home about it that night. Others kept one toy for themselves, not to use, but to remember the moment something pure returned to a world scarred by violence. as more camps were liberated. Neuengamme subcamps, Stalag family compounds, Dutch civilian sites. The pattern repeated. Each time, relief teams opened crates filled with modest but meticulously crafted toys. Each time, children approached them with caution that gradually softened into wonder. And each time, adults watching saw something break open inside their own chests. A reminder that humanity could endure even where cruelty had taken root. The turning point, then, was not a single moment, but a constellation of moments across Europe and the Pacific. It was the collective recognition that liberation did not end at the gate. It began in the emotional lives of those who stepped into the open after years of being denied the simple right to be children. And this wave of rediscovered innocence carried forward into the days and weeks that followed, shaping the earliest steps of recovery in communities that had lived too long in the shadows of war. Liberation did not erase the past, but it created space, small at first, fragile, to begin healing. In the days that followed the distribution of food and toys, relief workers observed a pattern that repeated itself across nearly every liberated camp. Children began to move differently. They walked with less caution. They ventured farther from the barracks, exploring corners of the camp they had previously avoided. Play, once nearly extinguished, became a quiet but persistent pulse running through the population. Medical teams prioritized the youngest, knowing that malnutrition had shaped their bodies during crucial developmental years. Many children required controlled feeding schedules to prevent refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal reaction to sudden calorie increases. Others needed treatment for infections, parasites, or wounds acquired long before liberation. Nurses recorded detailed notes, weight, temperature, hydration levels, and returned every few hours to reassess. Children clutched their toys during examinations, gripping them tightly as anchors of familiarity. The presence of toys altered the emotional environment in ways doctors did not fully anticipate. Relief workers noticed that children who had received toys tended to remain calmer during medical procedures. They held their dolls or wooden animals during blood tests, vaccinations, or physical assessments. Soldiers helping with logistics reported that children who possessed toys seemed more willing to approach kitchens, first aid tents, or clothing stations. The objects provided a sense of continuity in a world that was shifting rapidly around them. Parents, though physically weakened, watched these changes with cautious hope. Many were still processing their own trauma, grieving lost family members, confronting the collapse of the systems that had confined them, and trying to rebuild a sense of identity after years of suppression. Yet, even in their exhaustion, they recognized the significance of what was happening. When a child rolled a toy car across a cot, or hummed softly while cradling a doll, the parents saw evidence that their children's emotional worlds were not irreparably damaged. Relief agencies recorded these observations in official reports. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, teams noted that children in camps responded with marked improvement in affect and social interaction when provided with simple play objects. Red Cross delegates wrote that toys served as early indicators of recovery, describing how children who once avoided eye contact began engaging with peers when toys were introduced. These accounts circulated among humanitarian planners, influencing the development of child-centered post-war rehabilitation programs. In some camps, makeshift play corners emerged. Soldiers cleared debris from small areas and placed blankets on the ground. Relief workers added boxes of dolls, wooden blocks, or handcrafted puppets. These spaces encouraged free play, something many camp children had never experienced. They approached cautiously at first, lingering at the edges, studying the objects before interacting with them. Over time, they began to share toys with each other, forming small groups that played quietly for hours. Healing was not uniform, nor was it immediate. Some children remained withdrawn for days or weeks. Others struggled to adapt to sudden freedom, overwhelmed by the abundance of food, the presence of strangers, or the abrupt shift in routine. But almost universally, the simple act of receiving a toy created an emotional foothold, a starting point from which recovery could take shape. As relief operations expanded and families prepared for transport to hospitals, rehabilitation centers, or temporary housing, the toys traveled with them. They became keepsakes, reminders of the moment liberation became real. In dusty convoys across Europe or crowded evacuation trucks in the Philippines, children held tightly to their treasures. For many, the toy was the first possession they could truly call their own. This early aftermath set the stage for what would come next. The long, complex process of reintegration and rebuilding, where memories of those first toys would continue to shape how survivors understood their return to the world. As weeks turned into months, the liberated children began to leave the camps, first to field hospitals, then to temporary settlements, and finally to the homes they still remembered, or to new places where entire families would rebuild their lives from the foundations up. Yet the moment they had first held a toy remained woven into their memories, resurfacing in diaries, testimonies, and interviews recorded decades later. For many, it marked the instant they realized the war was truly over. Survivors who were children at the time often described the toys not as gifts, but as symbols of identity. Inside the camps, possessions had been interchangeable, sometimes shared by necessity, sometimes taken arbitrarily by guards. After liberation, the first toy many of them received became the first object they ever owned unconditionally. That sense of ownership was powerful. It communicated autonomy, individuality, and a small but meaningful return of control over their own lives. Families relocated to displaced persons, camps in Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, found that these toys served unexpectedly therapeutic roles. Social workers observed children incorporating them into storytelling, reenacting scenes from their past in ways that helped them process experiences too overwhelming for words. A spinning top became a character in an invented tale. A doll became a figure of comfort during nights when memories returned. Even broken toys, repaired repeatedly with thread or scrap wood, held deep significance. They carried the emotional weight of survival. In the Pacific, survivors of Los Baños, Santo Tomas, and other internment sites carried their toys with them into the post-war reconstruction of Manila and beyond. Some families emigrated to Australia or the United States, where toys became cherished relics of a childhood, interrupted and then abruptly revived. Decades later, museums and archives received these relics as donations. Faded cloth dolls, chipped wooden cars, a small elephant sewn from wartime scraps. Each artifact told a story deeper than its physical appearance, a moment when innocence was offered back to a child who had learned to live without it. Humanitarian organizations reflected on these experiences when designing long-term recovery programs. Psychologists emphasized that toys should not be considered luxuries in post-war rehabilitation. They were essential tools for restoring emotional development. This perspective influenced the creation of child-friendly spaces in refugee centers and war-affected regions throughout the latter half of the 20th century. What began as an improvised gesture in 1945 evolved into a formalized component of global relief work. Parents, too, felt the lasting impact. Many later wrote that watching their children play freely for the first time since imprisonment allowed them to believe that their families could rebuild. In the chaos of displacement, long lines for new identity documents, the search for missing relatives, the uncertainty of where to go next, a child's quiet play offered a sense of continuity. It reminded adults that the future was not only measured in housing permits or job placements, but in the intangible signs that life could be whole again. However, recovery was not uniform. Some children found comfort in their toys, but continued to struggle with the psychological imprint of captivity. Nightmares persisted. Sudden noises triggered fear. Crowds felt threatening. Yet even in these cases, survivors often described their toys as stabilizing forces, objects they held onto during difficult transitions. The toys served as reminders that kindness existed in the world beyond the camp fences. As nations rebuilt and families scattered across continents, the memory of receiving that first toy remained a quiet but enduring thread running through the testimony of former child internees. It represented a breach in the wall of trauma, a moment when the world offered them something gentle after years of harshness. And when these survivors spoke about liberation decades later, they often recounted not the soldiers' uniforms or the sound of distant gunfire, but the weight of a small toy resting in their hands. These personal memories, fragile yet resilient, form the emotional bridge to understanding the long-term meaning of the moment of rediscovered childhood. And from this bridge rises the final question. What did that day truly mean in the broader story of war, memory, and humanity. In the vast landscape of the Second World War, with its battles, invasions, and shifting front lines, it is easy to lose sight of the small human moments that reveal what the conflict truly cost. The day POW children saw toys for the first time does not appear in military reports or strategic analyses. It did not alter the course of campaigns or influence treaties, yet it remains one of the clearest windows into what war takes from the most vulnerable and what liberation can return. A toy is a simple object, a piece of painted wood, a stitched pattern of fabric, a string pulled to make something move. But in a world where childhood had been stripped down to ration lines and whispered warnings, these objects carried a power far beyond their appearance. They represented the return of imagination, a part of the mind that war tries hardest to extinguish, and that humanity must work hardest to protect. For the children who lived behind fences, the toy was the first message from the outside world that they were more than survivors. It told them they were still allowed to dream. For the parents, it was a sign that their children might reclaim the years that had slipped through their fingers. For the soldiers and relief workers, it was a reminder that the end of war is measured not only in ceasefires, but in the quiet renewal of ordinary life. History often records war in terms of destruction, but the memory of these toys endures because it speaks to something deeper, the resilience of innocence. Even after hunger, fear, and silence, the capacity for joy remained. It needed only the smallest spark to reappear. And so, in courtyards littered with debris, on the floors of emptied barracks, or in the arms of children carried to safety, a simple doll or wooden car became a symbol of survival, not just of bodies, but of childhood itself. In the end, these moments remind us that amid the ruins of the largest conflict in human history, humanity was rebuilt not only through treaties and reconstruction, but through the quiet sound of a child learning to play again.